I think one of the biggest challenges will be the thing around interbank latency and unreliability. I mean, for the benefit of those who don't know the meaning of latency, it's the time taken to process a transaction, basically. Sending a request message, getting a response, for the transaction to be completed. That's like one of the biggest challenges that I think that African fintechs face, especially, in a market like Nigeria. You have a major switch, like the NIBS instant payment, known as NIP for short, where you see latency spikes, especially like, during peak hours, over the weekends, public holidays, and possible that a bank is going through degradation or maintenance or something like that, and it impacts the speed at which a transaction is being processed. I'm sure that people would have experienced a situation where you're trying to do a transfer to a bank account and you actually get an error from your bank, on your mobile banking app, saying that the beneficiary bank is unreachable, for example. The funds would have been debited from you, and it's the responsibility of your bank where you're sending the money from to return the money. So we see things like that. And, for any fintech that is, for example, integrating virtual account payments or bank transfer payment methods for their merchants or their customers, these are some of the challenges that, you typically face in a market like Nigeria. I think another one will be the inconsistencies between the bank's APIs. So, looking at interbank dynamics again, you have a scenario where there's a standard, there's a framework from NIBS for instant payments, which is adopted by all the banks, right? But, within each bank, they have their own uniquenesses in terms of their standards, the APIs with which they process these interbank payments. You have a scenario where Bank A is using a different core banking application from Bank B, for example. And based on that, they need to conform to the industry standard. However, they have their own particular way of processing these transactions. So as a fintech that is in the middle of all this, trying to integrate multiple banks, you need to be able to go through the hassle of understanding the specifications of each of the banks. For example, a bank can be returning an error as 001, while another bank is returning an error as invalid transaction, but they mean the same thing. So integrating into multiple banks and having those types of transactions being processed between different banks, you need to be able to understand exactly what it is and ensure that, you are covering the different complexities and particularities that you have within different banks. I think another interesting one will be lack of real-time issue visibility. So, technology is not 100%, right? Issues will come up from time to time, but there is a responsibility for you as a bank or as a payment provider to ensure that you are giving visibility into these issues on time so that it doesn't affect user experience. For example, I think one of the neobanks in Nigeria, for example, one of the things that they've been able to do, I don't know if anybody has seen it, but they are trying to do a transfer to a particular bank, and they can actually show you this is the uptime of each of the banks, right? So right there and then, you are making a decision as to whether you want to still go ahead with that transfer or not. We've seen some other proactive methods of doing it, like having an uptime status page on your website, for example, where people can go and see what the current status updates are. Is there downtime? Is there degradation happening? I've also seen scenarios where you can even integrate notifications with some of these players, where once there's an issue, there's an automatic email sent, there's a webhook notification, for example, that is sent, or an alert telling you that there's an uptime and this is not available at the moment. And in that way, as a fintech, you are able to manage or come up with a process, right, with which you can manage such situations where they come up because of proactive notifications and alerts. So I would say those are the three biggest challenges that I have seen so far in the space, especially in a market like Nigeria. Yes, thanks for that. I mean, the reason why I'm smiling is this is a very, very interesting one, quite common, especially when you are doing integrations with payment providers and payment gateways. One of the things that I would always tell anybody that cares to listen is that the way I know a good payment processor or a connector is the fact that your sandbox environment is pretty much the same thing as your production environment. The only difference is that real funds are not moving from point A to point B, right? But the way to know that this payment provider or this payment processor is 100% or top-notch is the fact that your sandbox should be almost as good as production. I mean, I've seen a lot of things, based on my experience leading partner processor integrations, and enabling payment methods. I mean, in different regions. One of the things that I will say, for example, is the fact that your experience while testing in sandbox, for example, sometimes it's not what you see by the time you go, into production. I mean, I'll try not to be, too technical. So for example, I have seen scenarios where you have integrated a wallet payment method, for example, and you tested the flow in sandbox end to end, up until when a request is sent to the payment provider, the customer is redirected to complete a payment. The payment is completed, the payment provider confirms, and they send a webhook notification or something called an instant payment notification to say this transaction has been completed. Now, for example, in an instant payment notification, it comes as a request and it has a structure detailing the different details of the transaction, from the transaction amount, the unique ID with which the transaction was processed, the status of the transaction and all that. You've tested this thing end-to-end in sandbox. Everything went well. Now you go live and you are doing your first set of live tests and the payment, is initiated. The customer goes in, puts in their payment method details, approves the transaction. You get a notification from the payment provider, but the status of the transaction is not approved on your side as you had expected. And by the time you start doing your investigations, you see that the structure with which the payment notification was sent, for example, is different, totally different from what you saw in sandbox environment. Then by the time you bring it to the attention of the payment provider or those who are supporting you from their end, you find out that maybe there was a recent update done by the product or development team. It wasn't communicated on time, and unknowingly you have gone ahead to go live and you're now experiencing that type of thing in production. I mean, another very common one is, for example, maybe, this comes with more of security, I would say. For an instant payment notification to be sent, for example, again, it's going to be sent from a server, right? That server has IP addresses with which those notifications will be sent. Now imagine that a payment provider has provided 5 different IP addresses for you to whitelist on your side, so that whenever you see a notification coming from a server with this IP address, you know not to block it with your firewall, so that the status of the transaction can be updated. There was a particular provider that I saw where I could bet that every 2 or 3 weeks, they were sending a payment notification with an entirely different IP address. And it got to a point where you now had to get on a call with them and you actually explain the gravity of these things, because customers are completing transactions successfully. Meanwhile, payment notifications are sent from servers which the IP addresses are not yet whitelisted on your end. So our firewall is blocking it because we don't recognize this particular IP address. So we had to tell them, can we get an exhaustive list of all IP addresses with which you'll be sending these payment notifications so that these issues don't occur going forward? And I think doing that was able to, help us with that particular provider. And we saw that going forward, we didn't have that issue. In the event that they had a new IP address, they informed us ahead of time before deploying it, such that we had whitelisted it proactively to avoid those types of issues. Another thing that I will say is timeouts. Timeouts, are a very important part of, payment processing. You would usually see that fintechs would have thresholds with which they want to be able to process transactions, especially card transactions, as well as, alternative payment method transactions like bank transfers. The expectation is that they should be processed within a particular period. Even your merchant that you're processing the transaction for has a timeout threshold on their side. So imagine, you have some big merchants where they want to be able to process a card transaction under 10 seconds. So it means that between you as the fintech and your payment provider, that transaction also needs to be consummated under 10 seconds, because you need to be able to send a request and get a response within 10 seconds so that you can respond to your merchant with the status of the transaction so that they know whether they are giving value to the customer or not. So we see a lot of situations where that timeout threshold did not come up during sandbox testing. However, in production, which is now real life, you're sending a transaction, your payment provider is taking long to respond to you. We've seen situations where the transaction has actually timed out, but it was processed successfully. Because you as the fintech did not get a response on time, you have responded to your merchant saying this transaction was rejected. Meanwhile, the customer's store of value has been debited for that transaction. The merchant is saying this transaction has been unsuccessful, but the customer has been debited. So, it now leads to disputes, reconciliation issues, and all that. So that's another very big thing that comes up, which is a major difference between sandbox testing and what actually happens when you deploy to production. I think one of the first things is having redundancy. You can never go wrong with having redundancy. So imagine you are a fintech that processes payments for merchants in a particular market. One of the payment methods that is being used is virtual account transfers, for example. You cannot build a system or an architecture that depends on only one connector or payment provider. You need to have redundancy because things can go wrong at any particular time. So you need to be sure that you have a backup or a fallback. You see instances where fintechs have up to like 3 or 4 different payment providers for a single payment method. The most trusted one is the primary one where transactions go to. In the event that there's an issue, that the next best provider is who you are calling to be able to process that transaction, so that you don't lose that transaction for your merchant, and their customer as well does not end up getting dissatisfied with processing that transaction. So that has to be in place. It's something that is very key, and you need to have. I think another thing that is important is being able to route transactions smartly based on trends that you have seen or experience, you would see scenarios where, as a fintech, you're processing card payments for your merchants, but you know that this particular provider is the best provider for a particular card scheme, right? So you know that once a transaction is coming and you see that it's the card that is being used is from a particular card scheme, you know to be able to route that transaction to that particular provider, while you can route other transactions of other card schemes to other providers, as the case may be. It could even be as much as there's a provider that you know that processes 3DS transactions excellently, much more than some other providers. So once a 3DS transaction is coming from your merchant, for example, to be able to send that transaction to that provider, while non-3DS transactions, for example, could be sent to another provider. So that's very key. I think a third one would be never be in such a hurry to update the status of a transaction. And this is, very important for alternative payment methods, like mobile money, wallets, bank transfers. There's a concept of, performing transactions synchronously and performing transactions asynchronously. So synchronously means that I'm sending a request, I'm getting a response, immediately. That response could tell you the terminal status of a transaction, or it could give you a pending status, for example. Pending statuses are very common with alternative payment methods, like bank transfers, wallets, mobile money. So you want to be able to wait after getting an initial pending status to get the instant payment notification from the partner processor. Even when you get the instant payment notification, it's always a good practice not to solely depend on the instant payment notification status, right? So the status of the transaction will be sent in the instant payment notification. One of the things that is always good to do is to integrate a get transaction status service as well, if the payment provider has it. What you are basically trying to do is that when you get the instant payment notification, you want to reconfirm the final status of the transaction before you update it with your merchant, so that you are not in a scenario where you get an instant payment notification that looks like, a transaction has been completed. You send a notification to your merchant and say, this transaction, is approved. You can give your customer value. And at the end of the day, you find out that you didn't get a terminal status of the transaction and you have gone ahead to approve that transaction with your merchant. So it's always a good practice to always still pull for the status of that transaction to confirm that it's the final status before you go ahead and update the final status of the transaction. So those are the top 3 things that I think are good in terms of an architecture when you are building your systems, especially for real-time payments. Reconciliation can be a nightmare. I think that a lot of fintechs, they typically overlook or underestimate the importance of this. So I think some of the key things that you can use to make reconciliation easier, especially for your reconciliation and back office teams. I mean, whatever you're designing, you need to make sure that you always keep a copy of what has happened. And by that, I mean that ensuring that you record every transaction attempt that has happened on your system. What was sent, what came back. Even if the transaction failed, always make sure that there's a record and there's a log of everything that has happened and has passed through your system, whether it's a request or whether it's a response. Even though there's a failure, it always helps you, to be able to reconcile and match things easily when you need to do it. I think another thing is also about the facts, just like I mentioned in the previous question, is to ensure that you are not updating the status of transactions too quickly. Never be in a hurry. Sometimes, notifications or confirmations are delayed. So you need to build your system in a way that you can wait a bit and, confirm the status of a transaction from your partner or payment provider before updating the status of a transaction. Another key thing will be automation. Reconciliation nightmares come up when the reconciliation or back office teams need to do a lot of things pretty manually. So try and see how you can leverage on automation, artificial intelligence as well, to be able to use smart tools and applications for your reconciliation, depending on how periodic it is, to be able to make things easier. I'm sure your reconciliation teams would thank you for that, making their lives easier and allowing them to focus on more productive and strategic things. I think another important ones will be implementing or adopting frameworks or tools that help to fix mismatches or entries or records that are not in sync very quickly. That's very important because you need to be able to identify when things don't add up pretty quickly. And, you should be able to have tools that you can use to easily investigate and troubleshoot them and resolve them in a timely manner. Sometimes if a refund needs to be done proactively, you should be able to do that. And you don't wait till your merchant or their customer is making noise before you're able to resolve them. So those 4 things I think are important for reconciliation. Okay, that's another important one. I think that, one of the first things, just like you had mentioned regarding compliance, I think it is key to ensure that the step of compliance checks, they need to be done early. Before moving money, before moving funds, you need to be able to carry out your KYC, fraud checks, checking out for money laundering risks or any missing documents so that you don't get blocked later. Since scenarios where money is stuck for weeks and months just because the required fraud checks or KYC was not done early enough. So that can lead to a serious headache for you and your customers. So that has to be done very, very quickly early on. Another one is adopting the use of technology that is flexible. You want to be able to design your systems in such a way that you can easily plug into different cross-border payment providers. Whatever payment method that they are using, you need to be able to deploy technology that ensures that your system is pretty standardized and easy to plug into any payment provider that you are using to process payments for your customers. I think another one is that breaking transactions into 2 steps, very important. First off is checking to ensure that if a payment can go through and everything is okay, just like I had spoken about the compliance checks. You also need to be able to ensure that after that is done, you can now actually move the money. This, reduces failed transactions. So make sure that you are doing all the necessary checks so that at least you can guarantee the success of a transaction to a large extent before processing that transaction. And just like I had mentioned in one of the previous questions, choosing a route that, making sure that you're choosing the best route each time at any particular point in time. Sometimes it's not about the fastest, but it might also be about the most reliable, depending on the transaction processing scenario. So always making sure that you're choosing the best route for your transaction at any particular time. So those 4 things I think are key to processing cross-border payments and making sure that they are compliant and reliable and you are choosing what works best for you. Yeah, another very key one. I think one of the first things is being transparent with your customers. It is very, very important, especially when you are dealing with third parties that you don't really have control over how they are processing transactions that you send to them. If something is delayed, if something is not happening as expected, the idea will be to be transparent enough with your customers and letting them know on time and explaining what is happening clearly and what also is being done to resolve those issues. So it's something that is very key. I think that that also speaks to error handling, ensuring that whatever is happening and where there are issues, you are basically giving them the specific reason why it's happening so that they are sure. So they know if it's a transaction that can be retried immediately or something they have to come back to later or something where they have to wait until it's resolved before they can move. Another important one would be offering options. So just like you would see that for typically when you want to make a payment to a merchant, for example, and you're using the popular payment gateways that we have in Nigeria, for example, there's a list of multiple payment methods, right? You will see scenarios where maybe for some reason card payments are not working, right? You see an option of using another card. If it's that the card payments are not even working totally, there are other options of saying, okay, pay with bank transfer, pay with USSD, pay with virtual accounts, depending on the payment methods that have been enabled or that are available at that particular point in time. So it's always good to give options so that in the issue that there's something happening, you can quickly fall back to a different payment method. Another thing is what I would term as watching your partners or payment providers very closely. Try and make sure that you are keeping a record of how frequently partner has issues, such that you can even come up with productive ways of being a step ahead when there are issues, right? If you've discovered one that is performing very poorly, you will be able to, reduce your reliance on them so that you can, use other more reliable partners. I mean, seeing a scenario in a particular country, a partner that's very, very notorious, for issues. I mean, anybody that is technical here will be conversant with 500 errors, right? I remember that between the product and the IT team, one of the things that we had to do was even develop a dashboard of our own, where we were actually using to monitor those errors that we were receiving from the partner, such that once we started noticing a spike, we're able to escalate it to our operations team, who was now able to engage the partner proactively to pick up the issues and get them resolved. So I think that's very, very important. Then, of course, you always have to be prepared for issues, be prepared for trouble, have backup plans in place, alerts and all that, ensuring that your team knows quickly when something breaks, or like they will say in the Nigerian fintech space, when somebody has cooked beans, you should be able to know quickly so that you're not finding out hours later when issues have happened and you're now trying to pick up the pieces. So yeah, those 4 things I would say are ways that you can proactively manage unreliable third parties and ensure that, you still maintain trust with your customers, as the case may be. I think first things first will be that end-to-end tests have been completed successfully in live environments. You are sure that you have covered all test cases that you can cover in terms of scenarios, edge cases, and all that. So whatever flows or operations you have integrated for a particular payment method, for example, you need to ensure that end-to-end tests have been completed Another thing that needs to be clear before go live is that you have your fallbacks in place. So you have your primary payment processor, but the fallback is ready as well, just in case that there are issues that come up by the time you go live. Another important one will be, just like I had mentioned earlier, having clear error messages and reasons. Error handling has to be top-notch, so that users are not confused or scared as to why something failed, and they know what to do. You have system-induced errors, you have customer-induced errors. You find out that customer-induced errors can be a lot. So in case the customer is doing something wrong, entering an invalid PIN, they don't have sufficient funds in their account, or they are going over the approved limits, they know how to mitigate against those issues so that they can have their transactions processed successfully. Before go live, ensure that you have monitoring in place. A good practice is having a dashboard so that once you go live, monitoring starts. You have reporting tools, you have logs, that you can easily and proactively check to ensure that once issues are happening, you can even pick it up before your customers pick them up. That's always the best practice. It's never really good for your customers to be the ones that are picking up issues even before you do. It doesn't speak well of you as a fintech when such things happen. Another thing is ensuring that customer support, the customer success guys, are also ready to handle issues. They have tools and applications that have equipped them to be able to support a particular payment type or payment method that you have enabled for your customers, so that by the time you go live and issues come up, they are well equipped to perform, first level, second level support for those things. I think a very good one is also having a war room where, if it's possible in the era of, remote work and all that, but I've had scenarios where we have co-located with partners or payment providers just because we had a big merchant that wanted to go live. So everybody is in the same room. The merchant says, we have gone live, started pushing transactions. As transactions are happening, as issues are coming up, you're able to proactively get them done just by establishing that war room. Everybody is in the same space. Issues are being picked up. Fixes are happening. Deployments are going on. Everybody is able to bounce off issues and ideas that are coming up as the go live is happening. I mean, if you are not able to establish a physical war room, then a remote one also suffices. Having a channel or like a group chat, could be Microsoft Teams, could be Skype. Well, Skype is dead now, so Microsoft Teams is what has been adopted now. Could be Slack, could be WhatsApp, Telegram, anywhere that you can actually just be able to collaborate with your partners and payment providers just before going live. So once issues are happening, you're able to pick them up and resolving them. One of the things that I've also found is in trying to investigate or troubleshoot issues, I have seen that calls, getting on a Google Meet, getting on a quick huddle or Google Meets call actually gets issues resolved much faster than having a back and forth via a group chat or even emails. So I think those 7 things that I have mentioned are important in your go live checklist as a fintech before you go live with a payment product or a payment method, as the case may be. I think one of the things was having daily calls at a particular time, ensuring that the payment provider had somebody that was going to be on ground to be able to support at any particular time of the day. There was one that I remembered that from time to time, you had to go and be checking the Google Meets link to confirm. And at the point, they were like, oh, you're trying to spy on us to confirm that you are still online, right? And I was like, yes, if that's what it takes for us to be able to support this merchant during this pilot or go live period, this is what we are going to have to do. So being able to have people on speed dial that you can reach out to that are proactive enough to be able to get there and support you. But just like Ares mentioned, there's nothing that beats the physical war rooms. You are right there with the person. So there's no excuse or there's no reason why they will not be able to answer you immediately to get things sorted out. So yes, that's one of the ways that, we're able to get people to ensure that, when you're in a virtual war room, you're present and you're ready to get issues resolved as they come up and respond in a timely manner. Yeah, just like I said, technology is not perfect. So whatever you're doing, you need to have plans, especially for backup. Ensure that you are well equipped to be able to respond to situations that come up where you need to quickly fail over to a fallback just to be able to guarantee the success of a transaction. Another important thing is try and reduce the work that your backend and reconciliation teams are doing. You find out that they are inundated with a lot of manual work if the reconciliation processes and backend processes are not, at least, if not fully automated, at least automated to a particular extent, where they can depend on tools to be able to get things done. I think another thing is, just like I'd said, transparency with your customers. That's what guarantees your credibility and integrity in the market. I can tell you for free that there are some, at work, in relating with the dev team and maybe our operations teams and some other technical stakeholders, on top of our heads in the different countries where we're operating, we know the best payment partners that we have, and we know the worst, or we know the worst of them. So we have inside jokes about them, and so your reputation is at stake, especially when it comes to movement of money. You don't want to create anything that leaves room for doubts or leaves room for reconciliation issues and disputes. That can get really messy. Compliance is very important as well. You don't want a situation where you have gone live with a payment provider or a payment processor that is not fully compliant or does not have the requisite licenses to even be able to process payments in a particular market. I've seen that there's a particular country where, and this was one of like the fastest integrations that we ever did. And when it was time to go live, that was when somebody in compliance, just based on their network within the industry, because they had friends within the regulator and all that, and they actually found out that this payment provider had actually brought up a fake license. But their documentation was top-notch, their APIs worked well and everything, but they didn't have the requisite licenses to process. So we could not go live with them based on that. So that's what it is, from my end. Yeah, so many things to talk about, but little time.